In this lecture, we're stepping beyond drafting as a technical skill and looking at how drafting functions inside real land records in Texas. We'll start by grounding ourselves in what plats actually are, not just drawings, but legal instruments that create, modify, and preserve property rights. From there, we'll walk through how platting works in Texas, when plats are required, who has jurisdiction, and why different legal situations demand different types of plats. Once that structure is in place, the focus shifts to you, specifically where the drafter fits in this system, not in terms of authority, that's clearly defined by law, but in terms of responsibility. We'll talk about judgment, standards, clarity, ethics, and why plat drafting is one of the first places in this program where professional consequences become real. Finally, we'll bridge this lecture into the lab, where you'll work with Civil 3D tools that offices use to enforce these expectations, templates, styles, and structured workflows that support accuracy and defensibility. The goal of this lecture isn't to turn you into a plat expert overnight. It's to help you start thinking like someone whose work will one day live within the public record. So with that introduction out of the way, welcome back to GISC 1336. Over the last few modules, you've been building a foundation that doesn't always feel dramatic while you're building it, but becomes unavoidable once you need it. We've talked about why drafting exists, where drafters fit in the surveying profession, and how raw field measurements turn into surfaces and models that other people rely on to make decisions. Today, we take another step forward, and we're talking about plats. And if that word already sounds familiar, it's not an accident. Also, not just because I talked about it in the introduction and you read the intro to this week's module. You see, plats show up everywhere in land ownership: deeds, title commitments, subdivision approvals, and platting meetings. But in survey engineering, a plat is not just a familiar drawing. In Texas, a plat is a legal instrument, and that single fact is why this topic deserves its own lecture. Up to now, most of the drawings you've worked with live in what you might call project or design space. They help design things, build things, and they can usually be revised, corrected, or outright replaced. A recorded plat does not live in project space. Once a plat is filed, it becomes part of the public land record. It gets copied, scanned, reduced, referenced out of context, and relied upon by people who were never involved in creating it, and they never will be. That permanence changes everything. A contour line that's wrong might frustrate a grading contractor. A surface model that's wrong might cost money. A plat line that's wrong can invalidate approvals, cloud title, or quietly create problems that don't surface for decades. It's the same geometry, but very different consequences. This is why plats are treated differently than almost any other survey product. Conceptually, a plat sits in a place that makes people uncomfortable, and for good reason. It lives at the point where several different systems overlap, and none of them are optional. A plat is built from measurements and geometry, so it's undeniably a technical product. At the same time, it is governed by statute and professional rules, which also make it a legal document. Then, once it's recorded, it becomes something even broader: a public record that people outside the surveying profession will rely on, oftentimes without ever speaking to a surveyor. And that combination is what gives platting its professional weight. In Texas, plats are typically filed with the county clerks and, dependent on location, reviewed and approved by municipal or county authorities before they are recorded. But once that happens, the plat does not simply describe land. It asserts facts about land, facts and deeds that deeds reference, that titles depend on, and that development approvals assume are correct. And from that point forward, the plat becomes part of the framework other systems build upon. And this is where a common misunderstanding shows up for students. Because plats are drafted in CAD, it's easy to mentally group them with other drawings you've already worked with. But legally, they behave very differently. While a grading plan offers guidance, a design drawing proposes intent. A recorded plat does something far more final. It declares, and that declarative role is what separates plats from almost every other survey product you will encounter. Once recorded, a plat is no longer just part of a project. It becomes part of the land's legal identity. This is a good moment to reconnect what we're talking about now with what you already know. In Texas, only a registered professional land surveyor, or an RPLS, may sign and seal a plat. That legal authority has not changed, and it is not shared. The surveyor is the one who certifies the work, accepts responsibility for it, and stands behind it as a professional judgment. But what often gets overlooked is when that authority is exercised. In many projects, the drafter is the last person to interact with the plat before it crosses the line from internal document to permanent public record. Once it is signed and sealed, it stops being something that can be casually revised or corrected. From that point forward, any change becomes a formal legal process. That reality places the drafter squarely in the role you have been studying throughout this course. Drafting does not create authority, but it does support defensibility. Your work does not determine where a boundary belongs, but it determines whether the surveyor's decision is communicated clearly, consistently, and without introducing new ambiguity. This is where the stakes change. A mislabeled bearing on a lab drawing is a learning opportunity. A mislabeled bearing on a recorded plat can survive into deeds, titles, and court records. The difference is not geometry, it is the permanence of the document. And that permanence is why plat drafting is never treated casually in professional practice. Even when the boundary itself is simple, the responsibility attached to the drawing is not. Every label, line weight, and note carries more weight than it would on almost any other type of survey drawing. You'll also see plats show up on the fundamentals of surveying exam, but not in the way students sometimes expect. The FS is not interested in whether you can draft a plat in CAD. What it's testing is whether you understand the ideals that plats bring together. When you work with plats, you're dealing with land descriptions, subdivision logic, and boundary principles all at once. You're forced to think about how measurements translate into legal meaning and how different forms of evidence carry weight when conflicts arise. A plat is one of the few places in surveying where geometry and law are inseparable. That is why the exam does not stop at asking whether a traverse closes. It asks what controls when it doesn't. It asks to know whether you understand why a monument might outweigh a distance, or why a recorded plat can carry authority beyond a set of computations. In practice, a plat is where survey math stops being an academic exercise and starts becoming professional judgment. The FS exam reflects that reality by treating plat-related knowledge as conceptual, not procedural. If we accept that a plat is both a technical drawing and a legal instrument, then the real question becomes straightforward, even if the answer isn't. Why do plats exist at all? In Texas, plats exist to organize land in a way that can be understood, enforced, and preserved over time. They take abstract descriptions of property and convert them into a form that can function within legal, regulatory, and practical systems all at once. At least that's the idea. And that combination is what makes plats indispensable and why they carry so much responsibility. At the most fundamental level, a plat provides clarity and permanence to property rights. Texas relies heavily on metes and bounds descriptions, which can be precise but difficult to visualize when reduced to words alone. A plat gives those descriptions form by tying lines to monuments and presenting them at scale. It transforms a written abstraction into something that can be checked against the ground and relied upon by people who were never part of the original survey. Once recorded, that visual record becomes part of the legal fabric of the land, consulted by courts, title companies, and future surveyors alike. Accuracy here is not about making the drawing look good, even though it's a nice plus. What it's really about is preventing disputes that would otherwise never truly be resolved. Plats also exist to enforce the law. In Texas, land generally cannot be divided for sale, development, or construction without an approved plat, and that requirement is not bureaucratic filler. It is a safeguard. Through the platting process, however cumbersome, governments ensure that new parcels have legal access, that utilities can reach them, and that drainage is addressed, and that development does not create hidden hazards for future owners or neighbors or the public. The plat is the mechanism by which private land division is brought into alignment with public responsibility. Beyond regulation, plats guide development in a very real physical sense. A subdivision plat does not simply record how land was divided, it becomes the blueprint that contractors, engineers, and utility providers have to follow. Streets, lots, easements, and drainage corridors all trace back to the geometry established on the plat. Long after construction is finished, the plat remains continuing to shape how land is used and transferred. Unlike grading plans or design drawings, whose relevance fades once construction is complete, a plat's influence persists indefinitely. Another purpose that often goes unnoticed is communication. Most people who rely on plats, they're not surveyors. They're the homeowners, attorneys, planners, and judges. They need a document that communicates boundaries clearly without requiring specialized training to interpret it. That's why plats follow strict conventions for line weights, labeling, symbols, and layout. Consistency is not about style preference. It is about ensuring that the public can understand what the document is saying. When a plat is unclear, the risk of misunderstanding and disputes increase. Ultimately, all of these purposes converge on a single responsibility: protecting the public interest. Plats help ensure access for emergency services, preserve infrastructure corridors, manage drainage, and prevent the quiet creation of unsafe or unusable parcels. Every plat represents a balance between private property rights and public welfare, and surveyors, and the drafters who support them. They play each play a direct role in maintaining that balance. So when we ask what a plat is for, the answer is not a single function. A plat anchors property rights and certainty, enforces the law, guides development, communicates boundaries clearly, and protects the public. If surfaces and grading are about representing and reshaping the land, then plats are about documenting and preserving the framework within which that land is owned, used, and transferred. They are the skeleton on which development hangs. And that is why in Texas, platting remains one of the surveyor's most serious responsibilities. So, what is platting for? It anchors property rights and certainty. It enforces the law. It guides development. It communicates boundaries clearly. And it protects the public. If surfaces and grading are about representing and reshaping the land, then plats are about documenting and preserving the framework within which that land is owned and used. They're the skeleton on which development hangs. And that's why in Texas, platting remains one of the surveyor's most serious responsibilities. So, in this episode, or this part, we focused on what a plat is and why it matters. What we haven't talked about yet is how Texas law actually structures plats, when they're required, what types exist, who approves them, and how choosing the wrong type creates real problems. That's where we're headed next. In episode or part 2, we move from purpose to structure and start unpacking the types of plats used in Texas and the legal logic behind them. Same lines, much stricter consequences. Previously, we focused on what a plat is and why Texas treats it so seriously. We established that a plat is not just a drawing, it's a legal instrument that becomes part of the permanent public record. Once recorded, it asserts facts about land that other systems depend on. So now we need to answer the next practical question: how does platting actually work in Texas? Specifically, when is a plat required? Who reviews and approves it? And what kinds of plats exist for different situations? Because in platting, choosing the wrong type of plat is one of the fastest ways to derail a project, no matter how good the drafting looks. Before we talk about different types of plats, we have to ground ourselves in a very specific Texas reality, because almost every platting decision flows from it. In Texas, where the land is located determines how platting works. That may sound obvious, but it is one of the most common places where confusion begins, especially for people new to surveying and drafting. Platting rules do not exist in a vacuum. They are enforced by local authorities, and those authorities change depending on whether the property is inside a municipality or outside of one. When land lies within a city, or in some cases within a city's extraterritorial jurisdiction, platting is governed by municipal processes. Planning commissions, city staff, and adopted subdivision ordinance shape how plats are reviewed, approved, and recorded. When land lies outside of municipal limits, the county becomes the regulating authority, and a different approval structure applies. The distinction matters because it affects far more than just who signs off on the plat. Different jurisdictions apply different procedures, different timelines, and sometimes different notice requirements. What passes smoothly through one approval process may stall or be rejected outright in another. Not because the geometry is wrong, but because the procedural path was misidentified. For drafters, the key skill here is not memorizing statutes or approval trees. It is developing the habit of asking the right question early in a project. Before worrying about line work, labels, or sheet layout, you need to know whether you're dealing with a city plat or a county plat. That single determination can shape everything that follows, from how the plat is reviewed to how it is ultimately recorded. Understanding jurisdiction is less about legal trivia and more about professional awareness. It's how surveyors and drafters avoid surprises, manage client expectations, and choose the correct plat type before any drafting work begins. In Texas, platting always starts with location, not geometry. In Texas, a plat is not optional whenever land is being divided for sale, development, or construction. That requirement is one of the core guardrails of land regulation in the state, and it exists for reasons that go far beyond paperwork. At a basic level, platting is required because dividing land has consequences that extend well past the individual landowner. When a tract is split into separate parcels, questions immediately arise about access, utilities, drainage, and long-term usability. Without oversight, it would be entirely possible to create lots that technically exist on paper but fail in reality. Parcels with no legal access to a public road, no feasible way to connect utilities, or no consideration of how water is going to move across the land. The platting process is how Texas prevents those outcomes, by requiring plats to be reviewed and approved before recording. Public authorities can verify that new parcels fit within an organized framework. Streets line up with existing networks. Easements are reserved for utilities. Drainage paths are acknowledged, and development does not quietly create hazards that will surface years later. This is why platting is so closely tied to public approval. A plat is not merely an agreement between a landowner and a surveyor. It is a checkpoint where private land division intersects with public responsibility. Once a plat is approved and recorded, its conditions become binding, not just on the current owner, but on every future owner of that land. For drafters and surveyors, the important takeaway is that platting requirements are not arbitrary. They exist to protect people who may never see the plat until the problem arises. The approval process is designed to catch issues early, when they can still be addressed cleanly, rather than after lots are sold and conflicts become expensive or impossible to unwind. In short, a plat is required whenever land division stops being a purely private matter. In Texas, the moment land is divided in a way that affects access, development, or the public record, platting becomes the mechanism that keeps the system functional. Once you understand when a plat is required, the next question is not how to draw it, but what kind of plat are you actually preparing? That distinction matters far more than students usually expect. In Texas, not all plats serve the same legal purpose. Each type of plat exists because a different problem is being solved. Some plats create new lots, others modify existing subdivisions, and some correct errors in the public record, while others undo plats entirely or dedicate land for public use. The geometry involved may look similar from one project to the next, but the legal context is not. This is why plat types are not just labels or filing preferences. They define how a plat will be reviewed, what approvals are required, and what notices must be given, and how the document will function once it is recorded. A plat that is perfectly drafted from a geometric standpoint could still fail if it is prepared under the wrong category. From a professional standpoint, identifying the correct plat type early is a matter of judgment, not memorization. Choosing the wrong type can trigger rejected filings, delay approvals, or create confusion in deed and title records that follow the property indefinitely. In the worst cases, it can undermine the legal validity of the plat itself. This is also where the drafter's awareness becomes critical. Clients rarely arrive knowing whether they need a new subdivision plat, a replat, or an amending plat. They often describe what they want in everyday language. We're just fixing something. We're only changing a few lines, without realizing that those changes carry specific legal meanings. Translating those intentions into the correct plat type is part of professional practice, even if the final decision rests with the surveyor. Understanding plat types then is not about learning a list of categories. It's about recognizing land records that are cumulative. Every plat builds on what came before it, and every change to the record must be handled using appropriate legal tools. The right plat type keeps the record clear and defensible. The wrong one introduces ambiguity that may not surface until years later. In Texas practice, knowing what kind of plat you're preparing is just as important as knowing how to draft it. The category determines the rules, the review path, and the consequences. Geometry alone is never the whole story. When most people think of platting, this is the category they have in mind. Subdivision plats are the most common type encountered in Texas practice, particularly in areas experiencing growth. They're also the plat type most closely tied to public review, because they're the mechanism by which large tracts of land are transformed into lots that will eventually be bought, sold, and built upon. The reason subdivision plats receive so much attention is not because they're complicated drawings, but because of what they represent. A subdivision plat does not simply describe land. It creates new legal parcels. It establishes streets, and it dedicates easements that the public and future owners will rely on. Once approved and recorded, those decisions become binding. They shape infrastructure, access, drainage, and long-term land use in ways that are difficult or impossible to reverse later. For that reason, Texas law and local subdivision regulations treat subdivision platting as a staged process. Different versions of the plat exist to serve different purposes at different moments in the approval timeline. And these distinctions are not arbitrary, and confusing them can result in rejected submittals, delayed approvals, or plats that cannot be recorded. With that context in mind, subdivision plats in Texas generally fall into two primary related categories. First is the preliminary plat, and it shows the proposed layout of lots, streets, drainage features, and easements. It's used primarily for review and coordination with public authorities. At this stage, the focus is on conformity with subdivision regulations rather than the final survey precision. Planning commissions and staff use the preliminary plat to evaluate whether the development framework works before the details are locked in. The second one is final plats, which is the document that actually carries legal weight. It refines the preliminary plat layout into a record-ready instrument by showing precise bearings and distances, monumentation, certifications, and all information required for recording. Once approved and filed, the final plat becomes part of the permanent public record and governs the legal existence of the lots and streets it creates. In practice, these two stages serve very different functions. The preliminary plat is where layout decisions are discussed and negotiated. The final plat is where those decisions become fixed. Understanding that distinction is critical because a drawing prepared at the wrong level of completeness, even if technically accurate, may be rejected simply for being submitted under the wrong category. For students, this is also where theory begins to intersect with professional practice. Concepts like lot layout, right-of-way width, and easement placement are introduced abstractly in coursework, but subdivision platting is where those ideas are translated into legally enforceable form. The difference between a conceptual design and a final plat is not just precision, it's permanence. Once a subdivision plat is recorded, it is not necessarily permanent. Properties do evolve. Lots are merged, reconfigured, or adjusted to accommodate access, utilities, development. And when those changes involve land already governed by a recorded plat, Texas requires a formal process. That process is the replat. A replat is the legal mechanism used to modify an existing recorded subdivision plat. And these changes affect more than a single owner. They impact neighboring properties, infrastructure, and the reliability of the public record. As a result, replats are subject to greater scrutiny than original plats. And Texas law and local regulations often require notice to affected property owners, and sometimes public hearings before a replat can be approved. The goal is not to hinder development, but to prevent unreviewed changes that alter lot sizes, access, drainage, or neighborhood layout. From a professional standpoint, this is why replats carry more procedural weight than you may expect. You're not correcting a drawing here. You're proposing a change to something the public already relies on. Errors or shortcuts can lead to rejection, delays, or long-term confusion in deeds and titles. In a sense, replats are commonly used to modify existing lot boundaries, such as merging lots or adjusting shared boundaries, alter access or easements, including adding, removing, or relocating access and utility rights, or reconfiguring portions of a subdivision without disturbing unaffected areas. A critical requirement is that a replat must clearly reference and tie back to the original plat. Both the existing configuration and the proposed changes must be unmistakable. Ambiguity does not just create drafting issues, it creates lasting legal uncertainty. And for drafters and surveyors, replats reinforce that land records are cumulative. Each revision builds on what came before. A replat that fails to clearly communicate its relationship to the original plat disrupts that continuity and places future users of the record at risk. The goal is not just to show what is new, but to preserve a clear, intelligible chain of record. Not every problem in a recorded plat justifies reopening the entire subdivision process. Texas practice recognizes a simple reality. Small mistakes happen. Names get misspelled. Notes get left off. That does not automatically mean the subdivision is broken. And that is where amending plats come into play. An amending plat is a narrowly scoped legal instrument used to record limited issues in the public record without triggering full notice and hearing requirements. It's not a shortcut. It exists because the law allows minor corrections without destabilizing the recorded framework everyone already relies on. And this distinction matters. Used correctly, an amended plat fixes mistakes openly and preserves confidence in the record. Used incorrectly, and it becomes a way to quietly push through changes that should have faced public review. That is not a drafting problem. That is a professional failure. Amending plats are typically limited to things like clerical or typographical errors, omitted or unclear notes or easements, and minor boundary adjustments between adjoining owners. What unites these cases is restraint. An amending plat does not create new lots, does not eliminate access, and it does not reconfigure a subdivision. If a proposed change does any of those things, it's no longer an amendment, regardless of how small it feels to you. From a professional standpoint, amending plats are about ethics as much as efficiency. They're how surveyors correct the record transparently instead of letting errors linger or trying to disguise change as cleanup. And that is why reviewing authorities scrutinize them closely. The question is simple. Is this truly minor? When the answer is yes, amending plats strengthen the land record. When the answer is no, they weaken it, sometimes permanently. And not every subdivision problem is a big one. Texas practice acknowledges that. Some land divisions are small, limited, and have minimal public impact. For those cases, many jurisdictions allow minor plats, sometimes called short form plats. They're streamlined, and that does not necessarily mean that they're casual. Minor plats exist because local subdivision regulations are written to scale review to impact. The intent is not to reduce standards, but to avoid applying full subdivision review to projects that do not create new streets or infrastructure. And this is where students often misread the word minor. It describes the approval process, not the importance of the document. A minor plat is still a legal instrument, and once recorded, it carries the same permanence and legal weight as any other plat. The difference is how it gets approved, not how carefully it must be prepared. In practice, the responsibility is often higher. Minor plats are frequently approved administratively without public hearings. This means that a document itself has to do all the explaining. There is no meeting to fix confusion later. And minor plats are typically limited to situations where only a small number of lots are created, no new public streets are required, and public infrastructure impacts are minimal. Those limits are defined locally. A plat that looks minor on paper can still be rejected if it fails procedural requirements or submitted under the wrong category. From a professional standpoint, minor plats test judgment more than geometry. They require knowing when a streamlined process applies and when it does not. Submitting a non-qualifying project as a minor plat does not speed things up. It just signals inexperience. Understanding short form plats is not about finding the fastest approval path. It's about choosing the correct legal tool. Used properly, minor plats improve efficiency without sacrificing clarity. Used poorly, they create delays, rejections, and distrust. Most plats are meant to last. Once recorded, they create lots, dedicate streets, and establish a framework other documents depend on. Texas treats undoing that framework with extreme caution. And that is where vacating plats come in. Because what do you do when you don't like your plat anymore? You file a new type of plat to get rid of it. See, a vacating plat is the legal mechanism used to formally nullify a previously recorded plat, in whole or in part. And unlike other plat types, it does not revise the record. It removes something from it. And again, that matters, because a recorded plat represents a public commitment. Vacating it requires approval from the same authority that originally approved it. Access, infrastructure, and land use are not reversed quietly or accidentally. That's why vacating plats are rare. From a professional standpoint, they carry serious consequences. And once a plat is vacated, lots that once existed may cease to exist as legal parcels. Street and utility dedication shown on the vacated portion may also be extinguished, unless explicitly preserved. Vacating plats are typically used when developments fail or are abandoned. Previously subdivided land is fully reassembled, or legal or regulatory action requires it. Because of their impact, vacating plats must be exact. The portion being vacated and the effect on that action must be unmistakable. Ambiguity here does not cause confusion later. It causes problems immediately. Vacating a plat is not the opposite of platting. It is a reset of the record. And for surveyors and drafters, this reinforces a larger lesson. Plats are powerful legal instruments. Creating one matters, and undoing one matters more. And that difficulty is intentional. Decisions made during platting can last for generations. Reversing them is supposed to be hard. We already know that not all plats create lots. Some exist to establish rights that let land be used by others. In Texas, these are called specialty plats, and they carry the same legal weight as any subdivision, even when no lots are involved. They're not informal documents. Easements, dedications, and right-of-way create enforceable property interests that bind future owners. Specialty plat fixes those rights in space, permanently, because many of these rights support public or shared use. Mistakes here do not stay small. One bad line can disrupt utilities, roads, drainage, or public services. That's why these plats receive serious review. Common examples include easement plats, dedication plats, and right-of-way plats. What unites them is reliance. They are not descriptive. They're declarative. Once recorded, the geometry decides where the rights begin and end. There's no flexibility later. This is why specialty plats demand precision, clarity, and restraint, even when the area involved is small. So, as you see, platting in Texas is not one size fits all. Different situations require different legal instruments, and choosing the right one is not a final step. It happens early, sometimes first. And this is where many drafters hit their first real wall. Clients do not ask for plat types, they describe outcomes, just fixing a mistake, only moving a line, splitting it a little differently. Municipal staff may talk the same way. None of that changes what the law requires. That responsibility lands early, often on the drafter. A drawing that looks simple can trigger notice requirements, hearings, or approvals that geometry alone will never reveal. Context matters more than line work. Choosing the right plat is not about how much you draw. It's about what the drawing will do once recorded. Create lots, modify them, correct the record, erase something that already exists. Each outcome demands a different tool. Get this wrong, the project stalls or possibly restarts. Credibility stalls with it. Drafting is not just clean drawings, it's judgment. Choosing the right plat is not separate from drafting, it's what makes drafting matter. The range of plat types reflects a simple reality. Land ownership is not static. Properties are divided, merged, corrected, abandoned, and repurposed as needs change. Through plats, surveyors give those changes legal form. Whether you're laying out a subdivision, merging lots, correcting the record, or dedicating a right of way, the plat you prepare becomes part of Texas's legal and physical landscape. And that carries weight, requires precision, and judgment. In this episode, we've focused on how Texas structures platting, when plats are required, who approves them, and the major types you'll encounter in practice. What we've not covered yet is how those plats actually get produced responsibly inside a surveying office, the drafter's role, where your authority begins and ends, and how drafting decisions turn into legal consequences. This is where we're heading next, and in the final episode, we'll focus on the drafter's responsibility, accuracy, ethics, judgment, and why good plat drafting is as much about restraint as it is about precision. Same instruments, sharper responsibility. By now, you understand what a plat is and how platting works in Texas. You've seen the legal structure, the different plat types, and the approval logic that governs them. What we need to address now is simpler and more uncomfortable. Where does the drafter fit in all of this? Not in theory, not in a job description, but in the actual chain of responsibility that turns field data into a permanent public record. Because while only a licensed surveyor can sign and seal a plat, the drafter is often the last person to touch it before it becomes legally fixed. And before we go any further, it's worth slowing down for a moment and separating two ideas that students often blur together when they first encounter professional practice. In everyday language, responsibility and authority are treated as interchangeable. In surveying, they are not. Understanding the difference between these two is essential because platting is one of the clearest examples of how professional work is divided. Authority is tightly controlled, deliberately limited, and clearly defined by law. Responsibility, on the other hand, is distributed throughout the process. It shows up long before a seal is applied, and it extends to peoples whose names will never appear on a final document. This is where the drafter's role becomes easy to underestimate and easy to misunderstand. If you only look at who signs the plat instead of who shapes it, in Texas, authority is clear. Only a professional registered land surveyor can certify a plat, and that authority cannot be delegated, shared, or implied. Responsibility, however, is broader. Drafting a plat is not clerical work. It's the act of translating professional judgment into a form that must stand up to review by counties, cities, attorneys, title companies, and courts, often decades later. The drafter does not decide where the boundary belongs, but the drafter decides whether that decision is communicated clearly or buried in confusion. And this distinction is central to professional practice. A surveyor may resolve a boundary correctly, but if the plat mislabels a barren, obscures a monument, creates visual ambiguity, the record is compromised. The error is no longer theoretical, it's a preserved record. And that is why plat drafting carries more responsibility than almost any other drafting you will produce. And once you recognize that responsibility exists without formal authority, the next question becomes practical rather than philosophical. If you're contributing to a document that will become part of the permanent public record, what does competent work actually look like? The answer starts with accuracy, but it does not end there. Students often assume accuracy is something you aim for, improve towards, or demonstrate selectively. In platting, accuracy is assumed. It is the minimum condition required for conversation to continue at any level. Everything else, clarity, professionalism, defensibility, rests on that foundation. Only after accuracy is satisfied does the work move into truly professional territory. Accuracy in plat drafting is not a goal, it's a baseline. Every bearing, distance, curve value, area label, and monument callout must be internally consistent and defensible. Counties and municipalities routinely check closure, curve data, and area calculations. A plat that fails basic mathematical integrity will not pass review, regardless of how clean it looks. But accuracy alone is not enough. A plat can close perfectly and still be professionally weak if it fails to communicate clearly. Geometry that is technically correct but poorly presented invites misinterpretation, and misinterpretation is where disputes begin. This is where drafting stops being mechanical and becomes professional. And this is usually the point where students begin to place their trust in tools. After all, modern software is powerful, fast, and precise. It draws clean geometry, performs calculations instantly, and rarely complains. But professional practice is full of situations where the numbers are correct and the result is still wrong. Understanding why that happens requires stepping back from the screen and recognizing the limits of automation. Software executes instructions. It does not evaluate meaning, intent, or consequences. In platting, those distinctions matter more than students expect. This is where judgment enters the picture, and where responsibility becomes active rather than passive. Modern CAD software is very good at drawing lines and computing values. It will close figures, calculate areas, and populate tables without complaint. What it will not do is evaluate whether the results make sense in context. Software is not going to know whether the correct parcel was emphasized, whether a note should have been included, whether an easement is visually subordinate or dominant, whether a reviewer can read the plat at scale. Those decisions belong to people. And that is why professional drafting, cannot be reduced to button pushing. The drafter is expected to recognize when something is technically correct, but professionally questionable, and to raise that issue before the plat is ever sealed. Once judgment becomes part of the discussion, it's natural to ask why professional standards are so strict about how plats look and read. To students, those requirements can feel arbitrary or overly rigid, especially when the geometry itself is correct. But standards are not there to express preference. They exist because plats must be understood by people who did not create them, who may not share the same technical background, and who may encounter the document years or even decades later. Consistency is what allows that to happen without confusion. Seen this way, standards are not constraints on drafting. They're tools for communication and trust. Platting standards in Texas are not aesthetic preferences. They exist to create consistency across time, jurisdiction, and offices. A plat that follows established conventions is easier to review, easier to interpret, and easier to defend. A plat that deviates, even slightly, draws attention, slows approvals, and raises questions that did not need to be asked. And this is why professional offices rely on templates, styles, and standardized layouts. Not because creativity is discouraged, but because predictability builds trust. A reviewer should never be distracted by formatting. The focus should remain on substance. At this stage, it becomes clear that plat drafting is not just about satisfying reviewers or following rules. It's about anticipating how the document will be read in contexts far removed from the original drafting environment. Most people who rely on plats are not surveyors. They encounter plats during disputes, transactions, hearings, or emergencies, moments where misunderstandings carry real consequences. Clarity, then, is not a courtesy, it's a protective measure. A clear plat reduces the space where interpretation can drift, where disagreements can take root. A plat is read by more than surveyors. Judges, attorneys, planners, developers, and homeowners rely on these plats without necessarily understanding surveying conventions. The drafter's job is to make the document intelligible without oversimplifying it. Clear hierarchy, legible text, restrained annotation, and deliberate line weight are not cosmetic decisions. These are safeguards against ambiguity, and in legal settings, a clear plat protects everyone involved. All of this leads to an important reality about how platting actually happens in practice. No one produces a defensible plat alone. Surveyors and drafters occupy different roles, but those roles are interdependent. Decisions made by one affect the work of the other, and silence where questions should be asked is rarely neutral. Professional collaboration is not about hierarchy. It's about preserving or preventing small issues from becoming permanent ones. Plat preparation is a collaborative process by necessity. Surveyors interpret evidence, resolve conflicts, and determine legal positions. Drafters translate those decisions into a document that must survive scrutiny long after the project is complete. That process works only if drafters are willing to question inconsistencies, flag concerns, and ask for clarification when something does not align. Silent compliance is not professionalism. In practice, the best offices treat drafting as part of quality control, not just as a necessary downstream task. And as responsibility increases, boundaries matter more, not less. Professional ethics exists precisely because the work carries consequences beyond the immediate project. In platting, those boundaries are clearly drawn. Understanding them protects everyone involved: the public, the surveyor, and the drafter. Knowing where responsibility ends and authority begins is not limiting, it is stabilizing. While drafters carry responsibility, there are firm boundaries. Only the surveyor may sign and seal a plat. Altering a plat after sealing is prohibited. And these rules exist because platting is a legal act, not a drafting exercise. Understanding where your authority ends is part of professionalism. It protects the public, the surveyor, and you. Within those boundaries, however, the drafter's role is substantial. Your work supports the surveyor's seal. It does not replace it. By this point, it should be obvious that professionalism in plat drafting is cumulative. It shows up not in a single decision, but in patterns of attention and care. Quality control is where those patterns become visible. It is not a separate phase reserved for senior staff. It is a mindset that runs through the entire drafting process, shaping how work is checked before it becomes permanent. Many plats are rejected for small reasons: missing notes, incorrect scale bars, inconsistent labels, incomplete legends. These are not trivial mistakes. They delay approvals, frustrate clients, and undermine confidence in the work. Drafters who consistently catch these issues before submission become indispensable. Quality control is not an extra step, it's part of the job. By now, you've probably realized that this lecture wasn't really about memorizing plat types or learning another drafting checklist. It was about recalibrating how you think about what you're doing. Up to this point in the course, a lot of what you've worked on lives safely in that learning space. If a line is wrong, it's a lab fix. The label is off, it's a quiz question. If something doesn't quite make sense, the stakes have been low, and that's been intentional. This course is likely your first step into digital drafting and design, and it's designed to give you room to learn. Plats are where that safety net starts to disappear. A plat is one of the first things you've encountered in this program that is unapologetically real. It doesn't care that you're a student. It doesn't care that the mistake was small. Once recorded, it becomes part of the land's legal identity, and it stays there. That's why this lecture has mattered and been so important. Not because you're about to start sealing plats. You're not. You're not even close. And it's not because you're suddenly responsible for boundary decisions, because again, you aren't. But because plat drafting is where responsibility shows up before authority does. It's where accuracy stops being impressive and starts being assumed. Where software stops being impressive and starts being insufficient. Where clarity becomes a legal safeguard, standards become trust mechanisms, and collaboration becomes a professional obligation rather than a courtesy. In other words, plat drafting is where this course quietly shifts from learning how to draw to learning how to think. GISC 1336 is the foundation of this program and a foundation for your professional careers. Later courses will give you more law, more procedures, more technical depth. Field courses will give you measurements. Advanced drafting will give you complexity. Licensure will one day give you authority. But professional judgment, well, that starts here. Learning to recognize when something is legally fragile. Learning to ask the uncomfortable questions early. Learning to take care about clarity for someone you'll never meet reading your work decades from now. That's what this lecture was really about. Because long before you're trusted with the seal, you're being trusted with the record. In the lab that follows, we're going to shift from principles to practice. Up to this point, the lecture is focused on why responsibility, clarity, and consistency matter in plat drafting, especially when the work becomes permanent and public. What we haven't addressed yet is how those expectations are actually enforced in a professional drafting environment. And that's where this lab comes in. Templates, styles, external references, and structured data management are not productivity hacks. They are control systems. They're how offices ensure that standards are applied consistently, that drawings remain readable as they grow in complexity, and that individual drafting decisions don't quietly undermine the integrity of the final product. In the lab for this module, you're going to work directly with Autodesk Civil 3D tools that professional offices rely on to maintain that discipline. You're going to see how templates establish expectations before a single line is drawn, how XREFs separate responsibility and reduce risk, and how structured workflows protect drawings from accidental drift and inconsistency. The lecture has defined responsibility. The lab is going to show you how responsibility is supported by tools. Both are required to produce work that is not just accurate, but defensible. If you remember nothing else from this lecture, remember this. Platting is where drafting stops being academic and starts being permanent. Once a plat is recorded, it no longer cares who you were, how new you were, or how reasonable the mistake felt. It persists, quietly and indefinitely. Again, only a surveyor signs and seals a plat, but responsibility shows up much earlier. And what you emphasize, what you question, and what you choose not to ignore. Accuracy is our baseline. Software is a tool. Standards are about trust, and clarity is legal protection. Drafting is not downstream work. It is quality control of the public record. Long before you're trusted with a seal, you're trusted with the creation of the record.